and it is 9:03. So I want to welcome everybody to this presentation. It's entitled Emerging from the Cocoon, Managing Anxiety Around Reentry to Communal Life, focusing on what fortunately we're starting to see now is the resumption, obviously in small gradations and small steps of communal life, returning to work, returning to synagogue, possibly increasing possibilities in terms of celebrations, etc. Before I begin, I want to thank Ohel. It gives me the opportunity to give these kind of workshops, particularly our CEO, David Mendel, and our Presidium, Mel Zachter and Jay Kestenbaum. I also want to thank our tech team that makes this possible, as well as our PR department and my partners in arms and the trauma work that we do, Tzipi Ryder and Cheryl Chernovsky. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be presenting probably for about, let's say 35, 40 minutes. Please make sure you remain muted. The background noise can be very disturbing to everybody. Everybody should be muted at this point. I will welcome questions and welcome input as we're going along. Hi. There's two ways to do that. One of them would be to enter it on a chat. If you look at the bottom of your computer, there's an icon that says chat, and you can click on that. And there are two ways in which you can submit comments on the chat. You can do it open to everybody, in which case it'll be known who is asking the question, and the question will be available to everybody, or you can do it privately to me, in which nobody will see who the source of the phone is. Okay, already started. Somebody started already. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that later. Okay. So you can enter that's the two ways you can do the chat. If you want to submit questions or comments that way. At the end, when I'm done, when there is Q&A, if you're a brave soul and you want to ask a question or make a comment that would be heard by everybody and identifying who you are, then you can at that point unmute your phone and ask a question. Very few people choose to do that. Usually most people opt for the chat. If this is being recorded, certainly my piece will be recorded, and judging from the kind of, I should mention also, if I get a private question, I won't identify who the source is, but I will ask the question. If you're sending me a private message and you don't want it publicized, please just indicate that in the chat. Okay, all right, already. There's some questions, and I'll get to that, and I'll get to them in a minute. I think I'm just going to speak a little bit, and then we'll get to some of the questions. Okay, what I'm going to focus on is some of the challenges, both of trying to understand what it's going to be like as we reemerge, and some of the ways in which we can cope or manage them. So there will not be just hand wringing. We're not not going to talk and say this is all terrible and wonderful or whatever. We're going to talk about what we can do and how we can reacclimate. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be focusing on the return, and that poses a lot of problems on how to focus on that. Number one, it requires predicting the future, and my prophetic vision has been somewhat faulty lately. None of us are really capable of predicting the future. I'll talk in a minute about what we can use to try to predict, but it's less than perfect. In fact, I often say somewhat comically, if let's say February, maybe January, somebody who called me and says that they have a member of their family or a friend who is dreadfully afraid of a disease, and he's washing his hands incessantly all day. He tries not to leave the house, and if he does leave the house, he wears gloves and a mask, and he doesn't get within 6 feet of another person. If somebody would have told me that in January, I would have said this person has a serious anxiety disorder and needs immediate, if not psychotherapy, psychiatric help. And yet in a span of like 2 months, that became the norm. You can almost say that someone was not well if they weren't practicing those kind of precautionary measures. So it was very hard to predict the future. I often like to quote the great philosopher and theologian from New York, the Yogi Berra, who was apt to say that prognosticating is very difficult, especially about the future. So we don't know. We don't know what course this is going to take, what course the illness is going to take, what course the social unrest is going to take. So it depends partly on that, but we'll take our best guess and we'll try to anticipate how to, again, reacclimate. Also, I've noticed as I scan the list that there are a number of educators on the line also, so I'll try to address it from a school's perspective well, and I'm getting calls already. We are, Ohel, getting calls already from schools anticipating reopening in September and asking for our assistance, at least from a psychological perspective, how to help the children reacclimate to school. The other thing is that right now, if we talk about June 10th, 2020, we're kind of not here or there. We're sort of opening up, we're sort of lightening up, but we're not completely. The message from the experts, who themselves, to a large extent, are pretty confounded, and then again, I'm not saying it critically, it just shows you how unprecedented this illness is. They're sort of saying, yeah, we can start taking, we can start opening up a little bit, but, we're not necessarily out of it yet. So we again, it's very, we're kind of not here or there. And so and that's a very difficult place to be. We like certainty. We like to be sure of ourselves. And uncertainty in and of itself engenders anxiety. And we're kind of not sure, not in a sort of secure place yet. I don't know how many people have experienced, I hope not have experienced themselves, but may have experienced it through others, but we have certainly in the trauma team at Ohel, but situations where, let's say, somebody has, God forbid, been diagnosed with cancer, and they needed surgery to remove the tumor. And the big question is, did the tumor spread? Did the tumor spread to the lymph nodes? And this is life or death. And it'll take a week until the test results come in. And when the test results come in, and let's say they actually are bad news, that the results are positive. In other words, the results are positive, but the information is negative. In other words, that the cancer has spread. People will tell you that that's easier than that week of waiting and not knowing, because we don't like to be in that kind of place. So being where we are right now makes it even all the more difficult because there's so much uncertainty, and we don't know, and it's creating some inconsistency in terms of how careful how much careful people are being, which I'll talk about in a minute, which can be problematic. Also, by the way, the research on quarantine, and again, this is pretty unprecedented, but certainly that people have had to be quarantined. There's smaller numbers than we're seeing currently, but the research on quarantine, interestingly enough, shows that even when the need for the quarantine is over, when we can socialize again, when we can leave the confines of our homes again, people still, there's one of two approaches. Most people still approach with a whole lot of hesitation and almost continue to practice some of the social distancing and precautionary measures even when they're not warranted anymore, or at least have anxiety about being in close proximity to others and not exercising those kind of precautions, even though the risk may have been declared to be over. Maybe there would have been a cure, or maybe there was a vaccination. And the reason for that is simply that I often say reality changes a lot quicker than our brain does. That something will change, but until we mentally adjust, it very often takes a lot longer. I don't know how many people know someone in this situation, but I don't know if you know anybody who may have lost a lot of weight, somebody who was really incredibly obese and went on one of these these very intense diets and lost 80 pounds, 100 pounds, and are now look like everybody else. They have average weight for their size, and yet they'll look in the mirror and they'll see a fat person, because the brain doesn't adjust as quickly as the reality does. And the same thing happens with quarantines, that very often we've acclimated now to this danger. We are living with it as it's becoming like second nature. I think one of the most dramatic scenes that I saw recently was that we finally reunited with grandchildren, and my, I think she's 4, my 4-year-old granddaughter saw us, great excitement, went running to us, and exactly 6 feet away from us, just stopped. and stood there because she was so trained already to socially distance. So we've adapted to it, and therefore when it's no longer needed, we will, it will, we may allow ourselves to go out, etc., but our brain will still say there's danger. So so that's one aspect that we can sort of anticipate. And then we have the opposite extreme. And it's interesting because it parallels what we see in anxiety in general, is that those people who've had it, they don't want it, they can't take it anymore, they can't take the restrictions anymore. And now it's almost as if you've given them a finger, they want a hand. Now that the restrictions are being eased up, they're going all out. They're just forgetting about any precautionary measures. And we've certainly seen pictures that I'm not even putting aside the demonstrations, which there might be an overriding emotion that's governing that. But people, in pools and at beaches and with little or no regard for the potential illness, when we know that, in fact, we're seeing now an upsurge in some of the states that have eased their restrictions, that the illness is still around and still can be caught. So we get the people who are holding on to the precautions longer than necessary, and then you have those that are just sort of chucking them and can't take them more. And as I said, that parallels what we see in anxiety, because the anxiety is a tricky state to be in, because ideally, in most situations, we should have a medium level of anxiety, a modicum of anxiety. Too much anxiety, we get paralyzed. Too little anxiety, we don't care. For example, research on test anxiety shows that children who have too much anxiety, have a lot of anxiety, don't do well in the test because, again, the anxiety interferes with their focusing and their concentration. However, people who have too little anxiety, just don't care. And we're seeing those extremes here taking place as well. I see there's a few chats, so let me just address some of those issues and I'll get to go on. Okay. Okay, so that actually fits a question that was sent to me privately. So I won't obviously identify who it is. I'm not agoraphobic now, but I have no history of it. But I find myself anxious about going out. I've been forcing myself to go out anyway, and once I'm out, I'm fine. How long would you expect this to continue? Okay, so if you don't have a history, I think your first sentence said it most importantly, because those who have a history of anxiety, those who have a history of, say, of agoraphobia, and those in agoraphobia's fear of being in open places, then this tension, this pandemic will make it worse. If you don't have a prior history, then it's safe to say that your hesitation is not because of any kind of condition, anxiety condition, but it's because of the circumstance that we've been in. There's a real danger. And there was a danger about leaving. And that sort of addresses just what I said, which is the brain will hold on to that for a while. So on the one hand, you don't have to worry about, you will ultimately, and I think you did the right thing by forcing yourself into those circumstances. You do have to sort of put yourself in the situation. The paradox of anxiety is that you can't overcome the anxiety unless you put yourself in the situation. So if you're afraid of heights, you can spend your entire life living at sea level. It's a very restricted way of living, but if you want to, you don't go right away to the top of the Empire State Building, but you can gradually get to the second floor, third floor, whatever. And the more you're in it and nothing happens, the more likely you are to overcome the anxiety. So there've been a few requests for more therapy groups, for Zoom therapy groups for those who've lost parents to Corona. We did run 4 groups, 3 groups for people who lost parents, one for people who lost siblings. There were time-limited groups, and there were 4 sessions, and we will meet again once monthly with those group members. We had to stop them because we had other groups we had to run. We're currently running, I'm running 2 widows groups, and I will be starting a widowers group tomorrow night. And when that's over, we probably will begin some other groups of people who have lost parents. We have a waiting list. So please contact us. Contact Ohel, contact Laura Barth, who is our secretary. Let her know that you're interested in these groups, and we'll have you on a waiting list. We'll probably resume them, I'm guessing, in July when we're done with the widows and widowers groups. Okay, and someone else similar. Let's see, this to everyone. I've been out at all and want to start going out with a mask and social distance. Is it okay to go to a friend's backyard who tests positive for the antibody test and goes everywhere? Also, if I know anyone who has been positive for the antibody test, should I feel more comfortable around them? Of course, being socially distant. Need to go to a hairdresser. What are your thoughts, please? So that's really a medical question. And I think it needs to be posed to the CDC, to infectious disease, or to your personal doctor who's keeping abreast of those standards. My understanding is that the risk is lowered when there's somebody with antibodies, or if you're in a setting where people are wearing masks and gloves and taking those necessary precautions. But are we at a point now, and it might depend where you are also, because there are different levels of the epidemic in different areas. So I would urge you to contact your physician and get guidance there. Okay, I say it's okay to have grandchildren over now. What we did was, again, I'm going to take personal responsibility. I'm not recommending it. We got together with grandchildren in a large backyard. We did not go inside. I'll tell you, the grandchildren played with each other and didn't socially distance. But again, that was the guidelines we got. Please check with your own personal physician. Okay, control what to do about play dates. Feel bad for going outside around people. What is actually okay? How do you differentiate between what is a fear of going outside with other people and what is actually okay? I'm sorry, it's skipped. Concern about play dates. Feel bad for the kids. Not sure how to proceed. Any ideas? Again, these are really questions for the physicians. How much kids can interact with each other? We know that children can get it, and on rare occasions it can be actually very dangerous, but they also can be carriers and sometimes asymptomatic. So we have to go, on the other hand, how much can you confine children? And these are very delicate medical questions, and please talk to your pediatrician about it, or check guidelines that are being given from health authorities. Okay, this question was sort of, what is the fear of going outside around people and what is actually, in other words, I'm guessing what you're asking is how do you differentiate what's a real agoraphobia and what's a fear from the illness? And if it's situation specific, also, is there pre-existing? In other words, had you had these difficulties previously, then they're going to be exacerbated. Okay, now, by the way, to get back to the point that I'm making, and this speaks to something else that's very important in these circumstances, is to know yourself. And to know, are you on the continuum of anxiety or recklessness? Are you on the more anxious side or in the more reckless side? So if you're on the more anxious side, you might have to push yourself, like some people describe, to get out and start mingling to the extent that health authorities are saying it's okay. If you're on the more rash side, if you're just more impulsive, then you may have to hold yourself back a little bit more and realize that you're going to take risks that might be beyond what is advisable. So you have to know yourself, you have to know your children, and you have to know the people you're dealing with as well in terms of these issues. And again, the ideal is, and it's always hard to do that, have that medium, in other words, a level of anxiety that's commensurate with the risk that exists. Now, one of the themes that have come up, and I'm hearing this from a lot of groups that we're running and from a lot of people who have from some of the questions that have been posed in other webinars that I'm giving, which is we want to keep certain standards, reasonable standards that might be recommended by your local health department, wherever you happen to be living, and everybody around us is taking more risks. I mean, let's say the local authorities are saying, yes, you can go out and you can mingle, but keep 6 feet apart and wear masks, and you go outside and you want to schmooze with your neighbors and things like that, and none of them are wearing masks. And you feel different, or your kids come back and say, you tell them, okay, you can socialize with your friends. Maybe you can play tennis, which is not a proximate kind of sport, but you can't play basketball where you're on top of each other and breathing heavily. And then your kid comes home and says, oh, my friends are playing basketball, no mask, nothing. Well, how do you handle that? And, or for that matter, if you feel self-conscious or embarrassed, I mean, even put aside, people don't tease you, but you're the only one who's not going to the supermarket yet, who's just relying on deliveries, and you're embarrassed about this. So it's interesting that there's a body of research in psychology referred to as the locus of control. When that sounds kind of fancy, but what that means is, to varying degrees, everybody responds to their own internal sense of what's right or wrong. Those have their own internal sort of barometer that dictates, that determines how, what they do, and are also responsive to the outside world. So we have our own sense. Could everybody make sure that their phones are muted? It is disturbing when Okay, I'm just trying to see because there is one phone, one culprit, but I can't spot him. Okay, but you just make sure your phone's muted because the noise makes it hard. Okay, so everybody, everybody finds us again somewhere in the middle. You know, we're responsive to our surroundings, we're responsive to convention and norms. On the other hand, we have our own way of thinking and seeing things, and this becomes and some people are again at different extremes. So there are some people who are extremely responsive just to what society or other people dictate, whereas others have their own, are very internally directed and do what they think is right, and then they're sort of almost oblivious to the outside world. There's not one that's better than the other, and most of us fall sort of somewhere in the middle or leaning in one direction or the other. And this becomes important in these kind of situations. If you feel strongly that you're doing the right thing, then you follow your own internal control, and you can say that to your child as well. I can't talk for the other people, but this is our standards. And by the way, something very important, especially when we're dealing with children. If your child comes back and reports, yeah, all my friends, they're not wearing masks, they're playing basketball, blah, 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 call the kids' parents. You know, for all you know, they have no idea. And for that matter, they may be allowing their child because their child said that your child's allowed to. You know, I often say to parents, you know, our children plot during recess to undermine us, and we don't talk to the other parents. And so maybe if you get the parents together, as a unit, and you call them up and you say, this is going to be our collective standards, it makes it a much more powerful message. But you might have to find yourself saying, you know what, I'm really sorry. Or you might have to say, again, for yourself, or even for your kids, let's say, you might have to go, you know, look up some responsible sites, speak to some of the physicians. Maybe you are being too extreme, and maybe you need to ease up. So find your place, you know, judge, make sure, check with other parents, check with the standards, whether your standards are correct. But if you feel they are, and the other parents are really just not being, or don't have that kind of, don't want to take that kind of authority with their children, you have every right to. And then you can explain it, that you can, and acknowledge that it's hard and you feel bad. And hopefully this will ease up soon. But in the meantime, this is our standard. If your kid is a very sort of rebellious, headstrong kid, and he's not going to listen to you anyway, you know, don't get into huge power struggles. They just let them know this is what you expect. And if they don't listen, kids don't listen. Again, unless there's some huge health risk. I mean, this was a very big issue that came up. I did a presentation for the parents of kids of courage, or kids with serious, medical vulnerabilities, and the parents just couldn't play around. They had to really stick to the guns because those became life or death kind of issues. And then the bigger question is, are we just, and this is something I think we don't have an answer to yet, but I think it's something we all should be thinking about. Are we just going to go back? Are we just going to, when this is, let's say, declared over, okay? There was one cartoon, I'm sure many of you might have seen it. There was a sign, quarantine over, and there was a man and woman there who was so obese they couldn't fit through the door, and they said, what are we going to do now? But you know, when they declare it's over, are we just going to sort of wipe our brow and go back to being who we were before? Should we just go back to being who we were before? Or are we going to emerge from this different? And how are we going to emerge from this? So I'll talk a little bit later. I think we can anticipate that it's not going to be so easy to reacclimate, and there's going to be things that we have to do, schools are going to have to do to start this reacclimation process. But, you know, what's the world going to be like with? Are we going to come back with different sensibilities and appreciation? Are we going to have a different approach in general to safety and health? Will our understanding of disease change? I mean, if this could happen with this coronavirus, and even let's say we figure out a vaccination and we develop a herd immunity to the coronavirus, who's to say that another disease couldn't emerge in the same way? And are we going to be foregoing handshaking, social hugs, social kissing for that matter? Are we going to be like the Japanese? Are we going to be bowing? Are we going to be more cautious? Are we going to have different, that may linger, and may even, besides even, might linger because of how the brain doesn't adjust, but because maybe it's warranted. Maybe we'll have a very whole different approach to hygiene and illness. Will we be humbled? there's something very humbling about this. It's part of the challenge with this is that we're not used to this. We've lived at a time when we're accomplishing incredible feats. We're flying into space. We're communicating through the internet, and we have access to information like never before. I often talk about how we're in a technology revolution. That's going to put the Industrial Revolution to shame. And yet, comes along this little germ, and it literally pulled the plug on the world. And everything stopped. And maybe we're going to be not so enamored with ourselves. And maybe we're going to be a little bit more humbled in terms of what we can accomplish. And even, as I said, the greatest experts, and I'm not saying this with any kind of judgment, are so confounded. And social and political tension. What kind of impact is it going to be? How is this going to work out? What are race relationships going to be like when it's over? What's law enforcement going to look like? Are we going to have a completely reconfigured police departments and law enforcement than what we've had before? Will city dwelling lose its luster and appeal? In other words, that this people living in such close proximity on top of one another. I mean, I'm sure those of you who live in large metropolitan areas, and I'm assuming most of you are from the tri-state area, know what a subway trip can look like and how you can be bunched together, or even know what walking the street looks like. I know that I remember for a while I worked in this city, and sometimes I would leave around the time, around 5:30 or something like that, and I'd head to Penn Station. I remember when I'd look at it from a distance, and just the wave of people crowding into that Penn Station. I remember thinking to myself, this must have been what C.S. Mitzrayim looked like, the Exodus from Egypt looked like, but on top of each other, completely on top of each other. Will this change? Are we going to continue to do this? Will there be a move away from that? And then a lot of people are anticipating that. The cities will be more sparsely populated, and we're going to go to suburbs, to rural areas where we're not so much on top of each other. How much does technology how much reliance on technology for communication or for work is going to continue? Is it going to be more the norm to work from home, to work via Zoom, to work via the computers? And we've been doing it now for a few weeks. It hasn't been terrible. And even in terms of doing therapy, it's not the same as seeing someone face to face, but it worked out better than I thought it would. And are we going to be, is that going to be, again, more commonly used, a more common way of working? These are all thoughts that we have to consider, because it's entirely possible the world we're going to be coming out from, emerging from this, is going to be a changed world. Many of you, it might depend whether you're a pessimist or you're an optimist. Do you anticipate positive change, or do you see the whole world collapsing and social fabric of their society of coming apart? I like George Will's line that the nice part about being a pessimist is that you're constantly being either proven right or pleasantly surprised. So we have to think about this and what the world, we're not going to know for sure, but we have to be prepared for something change. So I'm going to talk about some approaches, but I see some more chats came up, so let me just quickly address those. Okay, how do you handle if your comfort level is different from your spouse? Excellent question. That's a very good question, and that can distinctly happen, not just, but you and your spouse may be on different levels. Usually, in situations like this, it's the one who's more cautious has their way, because it's less risky for the greater risk taker to, it's a little bit like, if I need to go out with a friend or a colleague who is not, doesn't keep kosher, they're going to eat in a kosher restaurant because it's where we can both eat. Usually that's what's going to happen. Sometimes you have to respect differences. And, this comes up a lot in marriage sometimes, not just in terms of this kind of anxiety, but it comes up regarding childbearing, comes up regarding shared grief, etc. That sometimes the couples, you expect them to work in sync, and the miracle of marriage is that you have two very distinct people who are working incredibly closely as a unit. And sometimes that requires either accommodation or allowing each person to do their own thing with mutual respect. But I think when it comes to a fear of contracting an illness and the danger that exists, then usually the more cautious one sort of has their way. And if they do, that should be expressed. That's not, you shouldn't just say, well, that's what you should do, but you should thank the person, because for the person who is by nature more of a risk taker, that takes effort for them to hold back and take that kind of restraint. But thank you, that was a great question. Okay, Private question that came to my husband has been strict with my unmarried children about going out because he is overweight and harassed my son who went to an empty shul to use deformity. There must have been something else. And now did a about face. He's done with limiting himself as it interferes with running his business, and he got a prescription for frustrating anxiety with, okay. I mean, again, there are certain people who are more at risk for having a serious case. And those who are more at risk may expect, I think legitimately, others to take greater precautions. But again, we can so much control adult children. And so you're going to have to make a judgment call then. I know some people have called me with similar questions that kids are returning from being away or something, just not being that cautious. And it worries them. They have to make a decision whether to say to the child, you can't come to our house, or to say we're going to take that added risk because we can never want to say to our child that he can't be in our home. It's a very individual decision. You have to weigh the medical pieces and also the psychological implications in terms of saying, and by the way, now we're coming out of the quarantine, but while we're in quarantine, and we're still partially quarantined, getting along is very important. And we're not going to fix necessarily, I mean, obviously serious interpersonal difficulties we're going to address, but some more moderate interpersonal tensions, we're going to try to just band-aid them, because when you're confined, or especially if you're confined to small quarters, getting along is very important. And all that have to be put in the scale and judge. And by the way, anybody who, it's a very specific situation, and if you do feel you need some professional assistance with that, Ohel's trauma team is available. You can contact, again, Laura Bart, our secretary, or contact us through the Ohel website. And we're offering free confidential assistance, not weekly therapy sessions, but interventions and assistance. And something like this, which is a case-by-case type of assessment, that might make sense for you to contact us or any other agency or organization that provides such services. Okay, can you speak about discouraging children to touch surfaces outside to maintain social distancing, et cetera, without making our children overly fearful? Okay, excellent. First thing you have to do, if you don't want a child to be overly fearful, is make sure that you're not overly fearful. Because children look to us as barometers, and by the way, we're not fooling our children. So if you are, quote unquote, overly fearful, and you think you're going to fool them by putting on a performance, we can fool everybody else. You're not going to fool your kids. They know us like a book. So first thing you do is make sure that you found that happy medium yourself. By the way, also fear is very contagious. So, and should be, because if there's danger, fear is protection against danger. You want people to find that out very quickly. If marauders are coming to your town and are going to occupy it, and you have to put together an effective defense in a matter of an hour or something like that, you want people to be scared, and it's adaptive. So fear can be easily transmitted. So first, make sure you yourself have found that perfect place. The children very naturally, not only touch things outside, very quickly put their hands to their mouths. I mean, research shows that I forgot the number, but I think children put their hands to their mouths like some 28 times a day or something. But maybe I think it's adults actually. I think children more so. Children constantly have. So it is a habit change, but you can do it if you're clear and you're firm. You're not overly fearful. Children also are, for the most part, obedient and will listen to the instructions that you give them. And it's a new world out there. And it wouldn't surprise me in post-coronavirus, children are going to be taught to be more cautious, to wash hands more frequently, to use hand sanitizers, and will be less inclined to touch their faces, and we can train children to do that. Okay, mute your video if possible. It improves the quality of the audio. I'm not sure how to mute my, to mute my video. Oh, no, it's not to have video. I'm not sure how to do that. Okay, all right. Okay, so how do we approach this? What do we do? So first of all, I mentioned that we can't predict the future. And it's a reality, even in the area of mental health. And sometimes psychologists are called upon, either expert testimony or in situations where, they might want to predict if somebody's going to have a breakdown, somebody's going to be suicidal. And our capacity our capacity for predicting the future, even among mental health professionals, is very poor. There's one criteria that seems to have some validity, and that's history. What has been will be. People and life is more consistent than inconsistent. So therefore, we can, if we try to understand it, we try to speculate about what's going to be, we have to look at what has been. It's the old line about whoever doesn't learn from history is destined to repeat it. And historically, pandemics traditionally have had beginning, middles, and ends, all periods of hardship, whether they were financial warfare, whatever. I mean, they've ended. They haven't lingered on. The problem is the casualties along the way, the fallout, and that's serious. And I'm not at all meaning to minimize that. But as we try to anticipate our return to communal life, or as we try to modicate, the level of anxiety, we have to, or if we were trying to communicate to our children, that this will probably resolve itself at some point. There is a possibility of a resurgence. The best reference point we have for this is the Spanish flu, which was about 100 years ago. Now, a lot of things have happened in medicine in the last 100 years. But in the Spanish flu, there was a resurgence when the flu season resumed. There is a distinct possibility that there will be a resurgence when flu season resumes. We don't know for sure whether there will be normal academic settings next year. Camp stuff is now starting to come out in some camps. Yes, some camps no. We're just starting to hear about camp, but understand that this won't be forever. I think we have to know that. And by the way, sometimes, and that might be part of what we're going to learn from this coronavirus, is that is to embrace the unknown, to embrace ambiguity, which, by the way, fits very nicely if religiously or culturally you have spiritual reference points, because part of being a religious person, a spiritual person, is to believe that we're not running the show, and that there are, there is a God or a greater being that is orchestrating all this, and therefore to submit to the ambiguity can work, but that's already, you have to have that kind of level of belief and that kind of level of spirituality, but that can be one way in which you can cope with the uncertainty of how we're going to reemerge and what's going to take place. There's a theme in substance abuse recovery about taking one day at a time. And sometimes that's what we have to do. When we start worrying, what's it going to be? What is it going to be with the summer? What's going to be with school next year? What's going to be economically? What's going to be socially? What's going to be in terms of, what's our world going to look like? And sometimes you can make yourself overly anxious about that. And you have to just, let's deal with June 10th. And if that's happening to you, if you are very overwrought about the very, apocalyptic changes that seem to be taking place around us right now, is just say, look, I'm going to deal now with June 10th. We'll see what June 11th brings. And that's an effective way of containing anxiety. And sometimes you have to create bubbles. Again, if you're overly distraught, if it's causing you enormous anxiety about what the world's going to be like when we get out of this, sometimes you have to stop thinking. Sometimes you have to turn off. And this has to do, by the way, with the news. I mean, the way we get information in news has changed radically in recent years. We no longer have just a select number of periodicals and the media that provide the news. There's thousands of sources of information, news items, and each one competing with the other. And therefore, that breeds a lot of sensationalism, because who can ever get the more sensational, quote unquote, breaking news or a headline is going to grab your attention. So we have to learn how to be selective about which news sources we rely upon, which sources of information we rely on. And the other thing is we have to be careful not to be inundated. That we have to sometimes just turn off the machine, turn off. If you have a kind of phone where the news pops up and it's causing you anxiety, you can turn it off or delete it. And obviously you need to be informed, and we have to be informed, and we have to be, especially when times are changing so dramatically, it's important to have your hand on the pulse, but may have to contain it if it gets to be too much and it's causing you anxiety. And as I said, if all that's happening is causing you anxiety. You may have to take breaks from it. You might have to just bury yourself in a good book, listen to some music, get into your exercise, learn or study, but take a break from it. I often think about, my mother used to tell me, may she rest in peace, who was a Holocaust survivor, told me that before she was deported, they lived in the ghetto, and the ghetto was, 3-4 families in one apartment, barely any food, daily deportations, beatings, assaults, and it was a very hard life. But she said that when the Shabbat came, when the Sabbath came, it was like it wasn't there. I mean, they were remotely aware, but for those 25 hours, there were no Nazis, there were no deportations. And sometimes we have to sort of artificially sort of create these breaks from the tension that's going around us. I think we have to be realistic, that we're not just going to, when this is over, whatever over is going to be, we're not just going to, as I said before, we're not just going to sigh a sigh of relief and go right back to the way we were. It's going to be, I think it's fair to assume that it's going to be, that we're going to take some of these experiences with us. But not only that, and I think this is important for particularly schools, but even work settings that may be reopening, if you are reopening, or if school is going to resume in September, don't just think it's going to be another first day of an academic year. I think the children are going to need to process what they've been through. This has been a trauma, and you can't just ignore it. Trauma, the ill effects of trauma catches up with you. I think there has to be a sort of commemorative events that acknowledge that we are now resuming communal school, even though we've been deprived of it. There may be new guidelines of health precautions and et cetera, and those may have to be imparted and explained to the children, and we have to allow them to process it. Another consideration, and again, this is a whole topic unto itself, but if there will not be summer camp, and I think for our times, summer camp, whether it's day camp or sleepaway camp, is very much the norm. Or even if your children don't go to camp but have, communal ways of relaxing and having all that replenishment you get from the summer, whether it's more exercise, ball playing, swimming, and relief from the tension of an academic setting. If our kids don't have that or have a truncated version of that, they may not come back to the school year. They may not come back into the same strength and freshness that they would otherwise, and maybe we have to more carefully ease them into the academic demands, because they may come back stressed with some post-trauma reactions, and without as I said, the replenishment and the refreshing that they get from a more normal summer. And that's something I think, as I see their educators on, that I think schools have to give some consideration to. We're already been approached by some schools, and we're happy to help. And I think it has to be partnerships, because we're not educators, but we can certainly work with schools in terms of what we believe will be the psychological reacclimation. And as I said, it needs to be done gradually, even in workplaces. Also, when there's a great deal of upheaval medically, upheaval socially, may not be the time to make rash decisions. People are in a heightened state of emotions, and sometimes I have heard people that I've been talking to say, I'm going to move, I'm going to relocate, I'm going to get armed, people are talking with a great deal of tension, and where emotion and fear is governing their decisions, and sometimes decisions that may have like fairly long-term bearing. Going to get married, have more children, whatever it might be. Now's not a time to make rash decisions. Yes, people are getting engaged, people are having children, and that's fine if it's being done, thought out. But if you're in a heightened state of anxiety and panic, that's not the time to make lifelong decisions, and maybe you have to postpone some of those decisions. And even when this is over, allow ourselves to digest it, allow ourselves to let the impact sink in. It's an interesting thing about trauma, and this is a form of trauma, is that sometimes the reactions come late. Sometimes they come when the actual cause of the trauma is over. Now, one of the most dramatic examples of where we see this is in situations like residential fires. If somebody's house burns down, let's say everybody gets out and everybody's safe, but you lose everything. You don't have a stitch of clothing, you don't have your records, you don't have your driver's license, you don't have pictures, everything gets destroyed. And you have to find a new place to live, you have to deal with insurance justice. You have to rebuild your house, and a year later, you have a brand new house. You've replenished your wardrobe. You have all your documents. You downloaded all your pictures from online, etc. And that's when you start getting nightmares. So I think we can anticipate that there will be reactions, and there will be reactions, ironically, when this is over, when we don't have to be busy with worrying about our health and worrying about our safety and trying to figure out how the world is changing. That's when some of the fear and some of the tension may actually come out. And again, we may change. Dr. Tversky has quotes the famous line. One of the people he treated for alcoholism, the one said, "The person I was drank. The person I was will continue to drink." We're not going to be the same people if we were. I don't think so. I think we will be altered. On the other hand, though, I don't think we should anticipate that we're going to become radically different either. I don't think we're all going to become, dye our hair green and join communes. We're going to take, probably what history dictates is we're going to take, obviously be more similar than dissimilar to who we were pre-coronavirus, but we're going to be different. We're going to be different in terms of how we understand our health. We're going to be different in terms of how we understand safety precautions, etc. I have only a few minutes left. I was going to tell a story, but let's see what the comments are, and if I can be of assistance to those. Oh, okay, thank you. Here's another private one. My children were looking forward to camp this summer, and since pandemic changed our plans, we have arranged round robin for them to have a socialize, but not be exposed to camp. What advice can you give to help them deal with the disappointment? This friend is going to camp. Why can't I? All right, first of all, if your child is not going to camp, it is a deprivation. It's a real setback. Just like if your child's not having a bar mitzvah or not having graduation, is having or a very compromised wedding, etc. The best thing you can do, and I've known this, and I know a little more since this virus, is commiserate, acknowledge, validate it. This stinks. It's really terrible. I really feel bad for you. And I feel bad for you that so-and-so is able to go to camp and you can't go to camp. And you'll be surprised how comforting that is. You might think, well, now I'm telling you how right he is to be upset, so he's going to get more upset. But we want to be understood. And very often, especially in life when we're dealing with problems that we can't solve or undo, it's very comforting to feel validated and to feel that this is legitimate. And, it is. And hopefully they'll come out more resilient. Hopefully maybe they'll learn that not everything works out in life and be better insulated and protected in the future if there's setbacks. But this is a setback. And as I said earlier, I could anticipate if there's not going to be real camp experiences or very compromised camp experiences, the kids will not come back as refreshed as they usually are at the beginning of the academic year. So validate it. And if they ask, why can't I? There are ways to say to children, sometimes, life's not always fair. There are many circumstances that we all think through our lives where things don't always work out even-handedly. We expect it. My father, may rest in peace, used to say at the table when he was giving out drinks that he has to count the bubbles in the Pepsi Cola to make sure he gives an equal number to everybody. Not everybody gets the same number of bubbles in the Pepsi Cola. So you're right to feel upset. I feel bad too, and I wish you could go to camp, but it's just not working out, and we're going to make the best of it. And it'll be a hard pill to swallow, but sometimes it's important to have hard pills to swallow. It's interesting, the research on hardship, the research on what we would often refer to as the school of hard knocks. Is it beneficial or is it not? And what the research seems to show, and I think it's very profound, just being exposed to hardship doesn't make you a stronger person. Being exposed to hardship and having a healthy attitude about it makes a difference. So we have a chance right now, as our lives and our children's lives are being frustrated in so many ways, how to nurture an attitude towards it that will be useful to them, how to build up their muscle, if you will, their emotional resilience and muscle. Okay, one more private question. Would you say extreme because not going out at all, except to put out garbage with masks, not even take walks, because according to MIT study, respiratory droplets can be in the air for hours in our densely populated enclaves, hard to avoid people, having groceries delivered even in 95 you can't, 95 masks are not foolproof. So is it extreme? Let's say it is. So what? I mean, if you're not harming anybody, and if you want to take, let's forget even when this is over. If there are people that want it, that are much more careful about, not being close to people, not catching colds, and or avoiding illness, you're entitled. You're in charge of your life, and you're in charge of your children's lives. So can I tell you by universal standards, is extreme, not extreme? I think you really have to, and it's judging my senses. It's going to depend where you're living. It's very hard to come up with universal standards. I think we have to rely on, as I said, we have to rely on the health departments and medicine. They know more than we do, even though they're still they still have their limitations as well. But you're entitled to have extreme positions, and as long as you're not harming anybody, you don't have to apologize. If that's what brings you comfort and it makes sense to you, do it. Okay, another private question. How can I avoid passing judgment on segments of the Frum society who are acting as if it's all over and have stopped all social distancing, wear masks, etc.? From what I understand, there's danger of resurgence if we all jump back into public gatherings so suddenly. So that's an interesting question, because there are segments of, and we're focusing maybe on the Orthodox Jewish community, but there's segments of other societies as well, where some people are being more dismissive about some of the precautionary measures, etc. And why is that so? Why are certain segments of the population more? And of course, even if we're talking about the Orthodox Jewish population, it's a very big world, and many are being, really adhering strictly to the government guidelines, and some maybe are being more dismissive. And the reasons for that, some of it might be the nature of the communities that they live in, where it's just so hard to keep people apart. Very hard. If you have 7 children in a 3-bedroom apartment, it's very hard to quarantine. It's not the same as quarantining in a beautiful suburb in a 12-bedroom apartment. So a 12-bedroom house with tennis courts and a swimming pool. So we have to be careful not to judge. I think that some of it has also been the very mixed messages we've gotten that haven't been on purposely mixed messages, but again, some of the confusion, even among the experts, and what I've heard from, if you're talking about within the Orthodox community, many have felt that the media in general has been so inaccurate. Certainly things that have been written about Israel and Orthodox Jews sometimes is so flagrantly false. How do we know it's not flagrantly false about this as well? So I'm not saying it, I think we have to be careful about passing judgment. However, where the stakes are pretty high here. And that might be something that we as a broader community have to, when this is over, have to look at. And maybe we have to learn how are we going to process information in general that we get from, let's say, government agencies or from the media, and how we're going to differentiate between what is important and those that we have to adhere to, and others that we have to sort of, in a way, dismiss or discount. So there's a lot of thinking that has to go into that. So I would urge you not to pass judgment, but I think we have to be cognizant of the differences that exist. And I said it's in other communities as well. I'm sure you've seen pictures on Memorial Day weekend in Arkansas and in Oklahoma and many other places where there was a disregard for the social distancing. So we as a broader community have to think about that. And maybe, again, this may be part of how we're going to come out of this, different people, and maybe wiser. It's hard to know when we are ready to allow our grandchildren to come to our house. I don't know how long we should wait. For Shabbos, we eat outside at tables 6 feet away. That's a common practice now, is to be outside and be 6 feet away. Rather than coming into confined quarters. I think it's a fairly safe guess from what I'm reading, that being outside makes a very big difference. I'll tell you personally, my practice has been entirely Zoom. Last week, I started for patients who want to see me face-to-face. I'm seeing them in my backyard. My office happens to be attached to my house. I'm seeing them in my backyard with confidentiality and with sanitizing the bathroom, which is easily accessible, and chairs in between. But again, don't don't be the expert yourself. Have respect, even though they are confused, and some of them are confusing. Do give the due respect to our medical experts, and try to adhere to the guidelines that they are prescribing. And again, if you're talking about grandchildren, that means you're at an age where you're at greater risk, and therefore may have to take more serious precautions than some young people do. But really, these kind of questions should really be either figured out by reading the from going to the advice of health departments, and as I said, emphasized earlier, may make a difference where you are, because there are different levels of containment depending where you are, and judging, so may have, or speaking to your physicians. And if you get guidelines and they're reasonable and other people are pressuring you, use that internal locus of control. This is the standards we're keeping. And that's sometimes necessary. So I really am not going to give you actual medical advice. I'm not a physician, but do access that. What social skills can I use to alert someone who's standing in my personal space? Okay, I was taken back when I joined a small world, and not only were people not 6 feet away, but standing face to face, talking to me. I think you can say, this, I'm trying to adhere to these and these standards. I'm not saying they're right, but I'm not, so ask people to respect your standards. If they don't, leave. You don't have to stay. And you're entitled, again, if you have these extreme, if you're showing up in a spacesuit and with an oxygen tank and asking people to stay 20 feet away, I'm not sure if that's a reasonable request. But if you're adhering to what many responsible agencies are recommending, you have every right to say that, without being, I don't think you should go around, get on the soapbox and harangue them, but you say, I'm trying to keep these standards, please, if you don't mind. And most people, if you say it nicely and in a not judgmental way, people are going to be accommodating. Every once in a while you get somebody who's going to mock you or something like that. But, don't take it to heart. But if it's really so, the lack of regard for this is so compelling, and you're uncomfortable, you have every right to leave. I mean, this is serious stuff. And if and by the way, you might be medically compromised, and I think that's the important consideration as well. You might have some pre-existing pulmonary disorder. You might be of an age, or you might have a heart condition, and these significantly exacerbate the risks. And you may have to be more careful. And I think we have to be respectful. We as a community in general have to be respectful of people. That people know what's in their own best interest, and not try to impose our standards on others. Okay, I think our time is up. Once again, I thank you. Thank you for coming, and it's very flattering. 118 people. Thank you. Again, anybody who has a very particular issue that want to have it discussed further, please contact us at Ohel, again, or either on the website, or Laura Bart, our secretary, Laura_Bart at ohelfamily.org, and she will forward it to our trauma team. And we have a highly trained, excellent trauma team who will provide services free of charge and with full confidentiality. Okay, again, I thank you, and we should all those who are ill should have a speedy recovery, and we should hopefully, with God's help, emerge from this quickly and relatively unscathed. Okay, have a good night, everybody. Be well.